Imagine waking up one day and realizing that everything you thought you knew about suffering, your heartbreaks, your failures, your illnesses, your relentless loneliness, was part of a hidden trial scripted by something far greater than you. Something that has been watching, judging, and perhaps even punishing you since before you were born. Now imagine the shiver that travels down your spine when you ask yourself, is this suffering random, or is it a message, a verdict, a sentence handed down by an unseen court of divinity? You roll out of bed, every ache in your body a question mark, every silence in the morning air a whisper of accusation, and you begin to wonder whether your life is not merely a series of accidents, but a ledger of sins balanced against you, written in invisible ink on the pages of destiny. And yet, if God, or whatever you dare to call that infinite presence, is truly loving, why would he allow so much agony to etch itself into your bones? Is this discipline meant to refine you, or condemnation meant to break you? The paradox deepens. The more you try to live rightly, the more you stumble into setbacks. The more you attempt to pray or repent, the more silence you hear, as if heaven itself has turned its back on you. And in that silence you feel the slow burning terror that perhaps you are not loved at all, that perhaps you are abandoned, that perhaps your entire existence is little more than proof of guilt before a wrathful, unseen eye. What if every failed relationship wasn't just bad timing, but judgment? What if every illness wasn't biological, but divine retribution? What if the delays, the betrayals, the endless struggle for meaning were not accidents, but carefully measured lashes of a cosmic whip? And yet, another voice inside you protests. Would an all-powerful, all-loving God truly function like a vindictive parent, punishing endlessly without explanation? Or is it us who project our human notions of anger, revenge, and punishment onto the silence of eternity, mistaking the incomprehensible for hostility? This paradox between a God said to be merciful and a life that feels merciless becomes a labyrinth with no exit, where every turn forces you to question not only what you believe about God, but what you believe about yourself. If your pain is punishment, then you are guilty. If your pain is random, then you are meaningless. And if your pain is a test, then you are both cherished and tormented, chosen but crushed. Which is worse? Perhaps you whisper to yourself in the dead of night, maybe the silence is the anger. Maybe the absence is the punishment. Maybe God's greatest judgment is indifference, leaving you to choke on your own questions without ever offering an answer. And yet, paradoxically, the very fact that you still ask these questions, that you still wrestle in the dark, that you still search for meaning in your suffering, could itself be proof that you are not abandoned? That the punishment, if it is, punishment is not meant to destroy you, but to carve something unnameable into your soul. But what is it? What lesson could justify the unbearable weight of despair, the cracks in your psyche, the scars on your heart? Could it be that punishment and love are not opposites, but two sides of the same unfathomable coin? And that God's anger, if it exists at Alice, not like human rage, but something stranger, deeper, a fire that burns not to consume, but to transform? You do not know, you cannot know, and the tension of this uncertainty is the furnace in which your faith, or your madness, is forged. You are left staring at your own reflection, wondering whether the universe is punishing you for who you are, or pushing you toward who you are meant to become. This is the great question. Is your suffering evidence of divine wrath, or is it the only language through which the divine can speak to you? That question will not leave you. It seeps into your dreams. It clings to your thoughts. It sits beside you in silence and, as you stare into its depths. You begin to realize that the answer lies not in escaping the pain, but in daring to confront the hidden roots of why it feels like punishment at all. You feel it in the marrow of your being, though few dare to name it aloud. The suspicion that pain must mean guilt, that misfortune whispers condemnation, that somewhere in the depths of the human psyche lies an ancient equation between suffering and divine anger, as if every heartbreak were a verdict and every illness a sentence. But why do we instinctively reach for this interpretation? Why do we imagine that the blows of life must come from a hand raised above us? Psychology suggests that the human mind is wired to search for causes, to impose meaning upon chaos, and when storms of tragedy rise, our inner narrative demands an explanation, yet explanations born of randomness feel unbearable. So we default to morality, whispering, "This must be punishment. I must have done something wrong." Carl Jung once spoke of the shadow, the dark and unacknowledged parts of ourselves we try to repress. And perhaps this is where the notion takes root. The unconscious guilt we carry, the unspoken doubts about our own worth, erupt into the belief that an invisible God is holding them against us. It is not merely religion that teaches us this logic, but the very structure of our families, our societies, our cultures. We grow up learning that punishment follows disobedience, that correction comes with pain, that to be loved requires conformity to rules we did not write. And so the child inside us carries this template into adulthood, projecting it onto the vast silence of the divine. When your father's disappointment turned into withdrawal, when your teacher's discipline turned into shame, when your community's judgment turned into exclusion, your nervous system encoded the pattern. Pain equals rejection. Discipline equals love withheld. And now, when the universe confronts you with suffering, your heart revives the old story that God must be angry with you. Consider how this belief burrows into identity itself. If every setback is punishment, then you are not merely unlucky but condemned, not merely wounded but guilty. And guilt, unlike mere failure, corrodes the soul from within, convincing you that you deserve every loss, that your very existence carries an invisible stain. Yet philosophy complicates the picture further. Thinkers from the Stoics to Kierkegaard wrestled with the riddle of suffering, and they too felt the temptation to equate it with divine displeasure. But Kierkegaard, for instance, saw suffering as the crucible of faith, the place where despair cracks open the possibility of authentic encounter with God. And here lies a haunting possibility that what feels like punishment may actually be initiation. What appears as wrath may actually be the stripping away of illusions. But can the human heart truly bear that paradox without breaking? For even if the mind theorizes that pain refines, the body remembers trauma, the heart remembers abandonment, and so the suspicion persists. If God is love, why does love look like cruelty? Psychology reveals another layer. The mind suffers from negativity bias, holding on to wounds with far more strength than joys. So the evidence of pain looms larger than the evidence of blessing, and our perception tilts toward a God who punishes rather than a God who provides. Add to this the cognitive dissonance of faith thought, to believe in a protector, yet experiencing betrayal from life itself, and the result is a deep psychic wound, a split between what we are told to believe and what we feel in the darkness of our lived reality. This hidden fracture becomes the true prison, not merely that we suffer, but that we suffer in confusion, unable to distinguish whether our tears are proof of guilt or proof of love. And this ambiguity eats away at the soul like acid. Entire societies perpetuate this narrative, shaping collective consciousness around the idea of divine anger. Droughts were once seen as curses, plagues as judgments, wars as holy reckonings. And even now, in the modern age, when science provides alternate explanations, the old archetype lingers, whispered in sermons and echoing in the quiet self-condemnations of those who think, maybe my illness is punishment, maybe my failures are God's rejection. Jung would argue that these archetypes survive because they are embedded in the collective unconscious, deeper than doctrine, older than scripture, carried in the very architecture of myth and dream. And so when you feel that surge of shame after tragedy, when you blame yourself for storms beyond your control, you are not merely fighting your own thoughts, you are battling centuries of inherited psychology, the echo of ancestors who looked at lightning and heard divine rage. Yet there is a darker dimension still. Perhaps society benefits from this belief. Perhaps the story of divine punishment serves as a tool of control, keeping people obedient through fear, channeling existential uncertainty into manageable guilt. For if you believe your suffering is God's anger, you will not question those who claim to mediate His will. You will internalize blame rather than rebel against unjust structures. You will fold your wings rather than test the skies. This is the hidden machinery beneath the surface, personal trauma intertwining with cultural conditioning, archetypal fear fused with social utility, all conspiring to keep you chained to the idea that every scar on your body is evidence of God's displeasure. And yet, in the midst of this labyrinth of psychology and philosophy, a question still burns. What if you are wrong? What if the anguish you have labeled as punishment is something else entirely, something neither cruel nor random, but operating on a level beyond the reach of human categories? To even contemplate the possibility requires a courage few possess, for it means loosening your grip on familiar narratives of guilt and wrath, standing naked before the incomprehensible without the shield of simplistic explanations. And so you linger at the threshold, torn between the comfort of a cruel certainty and the terror of an unknown freedom, aware that beneath the surface of your suffering lies a truth you have not yet dared to name, a truth whose consequences could unravel everything you think you know about God, punishment, and yourself. The trap is so subtle that most never notice it tightening around their lives. Believing that suffering equals punishment does not remain an abstract idea floating in the mind. It sinks its claws into every decision, every relationship, every dream you dare to imagine, reshaping the architecture of your existence from the inside out. For when you see your wounds as evidence of divine anger, you begin to treat yourself as guilty even when no verdict has been pronounced, carrying shame. Like a second skin, apologizing for your very existence, shrinking from joy as though happiness itself were forbidden fruit. Psychologists call this learned helplessness. When pain comes often enough, unpredictably enough, you stop resisting it, you stop seeking escape, you begin to believe you deserve it tanned soon. This belief mutates into a silent law governing your whole identity. Consider the person who sabotages opportunities, not because they lack talent, but because a quiet voice tells them, you are not meant to prosper, God doesn't want this for you. And so failure becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy disguised as divine decree. Or the woman who endures abuse, convinced her suffering is holy endurance, mistaking cruelty for discipline, never daring to leave because to escape would feel like disobedience to the cosmic script she believes has been written against her. This is how the unseen consequences unfold. Entire lives bent under the weight of a story that was never theirs to carry. Entire generations passing down guilt as inheritance, teaching children to see misfortune as punishment rather than circumstance, embedding in the nervous system a theology of fear rather than a spirituality of love. Neurology explains why this becomes so difficult to escape. When the brain experiences repeated patterns of pain paired with moral interpretation, neural pathways are carved deep, and soon the association between suffering and divine anger becomes automatic, reflexive, firing faster than conscious thought. Even when life offers blessings, the mind finds ways to dismiss them, to downplay them, to reinterpret them as temporary reprieves before the next punishment, because the brain has been trained to expect wrath more readily than grace. Cultural conditioning amplifies this trap. Entire systems are built upon guilt. Religious institutions framing suffering as proof of sin. Economies benefiting from people who feel undeserving of abundance. Families policing children with shame rather than nurturing them with acceptance. Until at last the individual no longer questions whether God is angry, but simply assumes it as the bedrock of reality. The consequence is staggering. You walk through life bowed beneath an invisible yoke, mistaking every delay, every sickness, every betrayal as confirmation of divine displeasure, never realizing that you are living inside a script handed to you by history, culture, and fear. And what does this do to society? A people who believe they are punished will become submissive, afraid to challenge injustice, hesitant to claim joy. They will confuse obedience with holiness, docility with righteousness, and in doing so, they hand their power over to those who profit from their despair. On the other end of the spectrum, some rebel against this story by abandoning all belief. Yet even in their rejection, they are still haunted by it, still carrying the shadow of punishment in their bones, still flinching at life's blows as though struck by an unseen hand. The true horror is not that people believe God is angry, but that this belief shapes them into prisoners of fear without their awareness, making them complicit in their own diminishment. You see it in the way people speak. I must have done something wrong. God must be testing me. This is probably my punishment. Each phrase is a thread in a web of self-condemnation, and soon the web becomes a cage. The emotional urgency cannot be overstated. Every day you live under this belief. You diminish the vastness of your being. You shrink from the expansiveness of your own existence. You confuse chains for blessings and shadows for light. And yet, beneath all this lies the faint glimmer of rebellion, the possibility that the story itself is false, that you are not condemned, that your suffering does not prove God's wrath, but reveals something far more mysterious. But to seize that possibility requires the courage to question the deepest assumptions, to tear open the narrative inherited from culture and psyche alike, to stand in the terrifying light of freedom where no easy answers are given. The urgency builds because you know, if you are honest, that to continue believing you are punished is to live half alive, bent and afraid, never tasting the fullness of what it means to exist. The unseen consequence of believing in divine anger is not only despair, but the quiet erosion of your soul's potential, the slow decay of dreams, the silencing of your truest voice. And only by confronting this can you begin to imagine another way of living. The question presses harder now, more urgent than before. If your pain is not punishment, then what is it? If God is not angry, then what is he? The answer remains just beyond your reach, waiting in the shadows of your fear, urging you to take the risk of rebellion, to step beyond the cage of punishment into a truth so radical it might shatter everything you thought you knew. not only about God, but about yourself, about love, about life.